You're standing outside a marble chamber. Inside, a woman is screaming, not from pain but from something worse. The guards won't look at each other. The senators in the adjacent hall continue their wine and conversation, as if the walls aren't shaking. This is a wedding night in Imperial Rome, and what's happening inside this room will define the next 8 years of a 13-year-old girl's life. The man she just married is Nero. The girl is Octavia. And by the time you understand what really happened to her, execution will seem like the merciful option. Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It amazes me every single day that a story this dark, buried for 2,000 years, can reach someone halfway across the world right now. This is Rome, mid-1st century AD. The empire spans 3 continents. Marble gleams everywhere. Gold flows like water. And behind the palace doors, a system of psychological destruction operates with mechanical precision. These weren't crimes of passion or isolated acts of cruelty. This was methodology. Emperors across decades, Claudius, Nero, Caligula, Domitian, Tiberius, discovered something more effective than execution. They learned how to destroy a woman completely while keeping her alive and smiling in public. The evidence survived in senatorial records, in letters smuggled from exile islands, in guard reports so detailed they documented how many times a prisoner looked at the window each day. This testimony exists because some women found ways to speak, when speaking meant death. What follows is what they left behind. The wedding night wasn't about intimacy. It was about establishing ownership. Imperial marriages were political transactions, and the consummation proved the contract was sealed. But here's what the statues and state propaganda never showed. Witnesses stood outside the chamber. Not just servants, senators, military advisors, members of the bride's own family, waiting in adjacent rooms for confirmation. The morning after, senior palace matrons conducted physical inspections of the new wife. They weren't checking for proof of consummation. They were looking for signs of resistance, bruising in defensive positions, marks that suggested she'd tried to protect herself. Any evidence of fighting back became proof of disobedience. And here's the trap. The punishment never fell on the wife directly. It fell on her female relatives, her mother, her sisters, her aunts. This created a system where imperial wives had to endure anything without showing resistance, because resistance meant condemning the women they loved to torture or death. Statilia Messalina married Nero when she was 24. She'd been widowed twice before, and Nero had personally ordered both her previous husbands executed. On her wedding night, Nero made her recite their names aloud before he touched her. Then he called for guards. They brought in her father. The old man was forced to stand in the corner and watch the consummation. Nero later explained this to his advisors. Ensuring proper submission required witnesses who mattered. Statilia's father couldn't hide his reaction. His face showed everything he felt. Nero had him executed the next morning. The lesson was instant and absolute. Show nothing, feel nothing, survive. But survival required navigating an impossible logic. If you cried, you were too weak. If you didn't cry, you were too proud. If you submitted immediately, you were pathetic. If you hesitated, you were disobedient. There was no correct response. The system was designed as a trap with no exit. Emperors were testing boundaries that first night, measuring how far they could push before something broke. But they didn't want quick destruction. That would end the game too soon. They wanted slow erosion, years of it, decades if possible. The daily mechanisms were surgical. Every imperial wife had food tasters, officially for poison protection, actually for surveillance. The tasters reported everything: what she ate, when, with whom, how much. Under Tiberius, the tasters themselves lived in terror. Report too much, die for disloyalty to the Empress. Report too little, die for failing your duty. The wives were trapped in parallel. Eat freely, get reported for gluttony. Eat carefully, get reported for suspicious behavior. Agrippina the Younger kept written records tracking which foods Claudius permitted each day. Certain items were forbidden on random days with no pattern. One afternoon, she ate figs from a bowl in her chamber. Figs had been allowed the previous day, but not today. Claudius had her dragged to the dining hall where he was hosting 30 senators. He beat her with his own hands in front of them. She collapsed forward, bleeding onto the marble. The senators were required to continue eating. Anyone who stopped would be punished too. They chewed and swallowed while Agrippina bled 3 feet away. The bedchambers had hidden passages built into the walls. Slaves stationed inside those passages listened through the night. Everything was recorded. Conversations between husband and wife, arguments, affection, even sleep-talking. Mumbled words in dreams became evidence of disloyalty. Caligula refined this further. He made his wives aware they were being watched. They knew slaves were in the walls. This forced perpetual performance even while sleeping. They had to control their dreams, and emperors visited their wives' chambers at random hours, noon, 3 in the morning, dawn, unannounced. The wife had to be ready always, bathed, dressed, cosmetics perfect. If she wasn't prepared, punishment followed. But if she was too prepared, she was accused of expecting a lover. Another impossible standard, another trap. Children were the sharpest weapon. Imperial children belonged legally to the emperor, not their mothers. This was explicit in Roman law. Children could be removed from maternal care at any moment for any reason. Emperors used this constantly. Octavia gave birth at 15. Nero took the infant immediately. He placed the child with a wet nurse in a different palace wing, a wing Octavia couldn't access without permission. She was allowed supervised visits once per week for 1 hour. Guards stood in the room during those visits. The child was instructed to call the wet nurse mother. If guards reported that Octavia cried after visits, her next visit was canceled. She learned to cry only in absolute solitude, silently, where no one could hear or see. Claudius had Nero beaten when the boy was 9 years old. A tutor reported disrespect. The punishment was standard, beating with rods, but Claudius forced Agrippina to stand in the room and watch. If she looked away, the beating continued longer. If she flinched, more strikes were added. If she closed her eyes, the count started over. Claudius personally counted 37 strikes while Agrippina stood frozen 3 feet away. When it ended, she was required to thank him. "Thank you for disciplining our son." She said the words. The threat was always explicit. Your behavior determines your child's fate. Protect yourself or protect your child. But protecting your child might mean enduring worse yourself, and enduring didn't guarantee your child's safety anyway. Public humiliation served multiple purposes. It entertained the court, it demonstrated absolute power, and it sent a message to everyone watching. Messalina was 22 when Claudius ordered her to participate in religious fertility festivals. These involved ritual dances normally performed by trained priestesses. Claudius required Messalina to dance while he provided running commentary to assembled senators. The festival lasted 3 nights. Each night, she danced on a raised platform, while he sat below describing her inadequacies. Her body was too thin, her movements too stiff, her face too plain. She was deficient as a woman. The senators were required to laugh. She was required to smile. On the 3rd night, Claudius invited senators to rate her performance numerically. Each man called out a score. The scores were deliberately low, planted beforehand. Claudius announced that her poor performance meant she'd repeat the entire festival next month. She did. For 6 consecutive months she danced while he mocked and senators laughed. Caligula required his wife Caesonia to attend state banquets dressed in full gladiator armor. Not decorative, actual combat gear, heavy and uncomfortable. Shield, sword, helmet. She stood behind his dining couch for the entire meal. Meals lasted 4 to 6 hours. If she moved, if she swayed, if she showed fatigue, he had her beaten publicly at the banquet. At meal's end, he made her remove the helmet. Her face would be streaming with sweat, makeup completely destroyed. Then she had to bow to each guest and thank them for tolerating her appearance. Nero kept multiple wives and mistresses simultaneously. He required them to attend functions together. Then he compared them publicly, describing intimate details in front of hundreds of people. He rated them numerically and announced the scores aloud. Lower-rated women had to congratulate higher-rated women before the entire assembly. At one banquet with 200 guests, Nero described his relations with both Statilia Messalina and Acte, one of his mistresses, in explicit detail. Then he asked guests to vote on who performed better. Statilia received fewer votes. Nero required her to kneel before Acte and ask for guidance on pleasing her husband. Acte had been coached beforehand. She provided advice while guests laughed. Both women smiled throughout the entire exchange. But emperors discovered something worse than humiliation, something worse than torture. They discovered civil death, divorce combined with exile that created non-existence without ending breath. An emperor could divorce his wife instantly with no cause, no trial, no justification. The moment he spoke the words, everything changed. Property seized, children taken, titles stripped. But unlike widows, divorced imperial wives couldn't remarry. Too politically dangerous. They couldn't return to birth families either. Imperial connection had contaminated them. They existed in legal limbo, neither married nor unmarried, neither free nor imprisoned, just suspended in permanent non-existence. Nero divorced Octavia when she was 21. He exiled her to Panditaria, a small island off the Italian coast. The garrison, 12 soldiers, 2 female servants who were both imperial spies, 1 building, 4 rooms total, food, grain, water, occasional fish. No visitors permitted. No letters sent or received. No books, no music, no entertainment of any kind. Guard reports from her exile survived in Roman archives. They documented her routine with crushing precision. She woke at dawn because guards opened her shutters. She had no choice when to wake. 2 meals arrived at times controlled by guards. She was allowed outside 1 hour per day under supervision. The remaining hours she spent alone in her room with nothing to do. She was forbidden from speaking to guards. Guards were forbidden from acknowledging her presence. Complete sensory deprivation, except during meals. She survived 6 months this way, wondering every single day if guards would come with an execution order. They finally did. Julia the Elder was Augustus's daughter. He exiled her at 38. She lived 20 years in exile, dying at 58. The island was Ventotene, 1-room apartment. No visitors for 2 decades except supply ships every 3 months. Augustus died 14 years into her exile. She wasn't informed. She learned about his death 8 months later from a random comment by a supply ship captain. She died 6 years after that, still on the island, never having left. The psychological design of these exile locations was deliberate. Small islands made escape impossible, but they were visible from the mainland. Exiled wives could see civilization across the water. They could see the world they'd never reach again, close enough to remember, too far to hope. Suicide meant reclaiming control. One final choice that belonged to the woman alone. Emperors couldn't tolerate that. Active prevention measures were implemented. Guards received specific training to watch for attempts. Living quarters inspected regularly for potential weapons. No cords, no belts, no long fabric that could become nooses. Meals served in wooden bowls. No breakable dishes meant no sharp edges. Even hairpins forbidden. Plancina was under house arrest during Tiberius's reign, awaiting trial for treason. She made 3 documented attempts to end her life. First, strangling herself with bed linens. Guards found her unconscious and revived her. All fabric was removed except what she wore. Second, she tried starving herself. Guards force-fed her. Third, she tried breaking a pottery jar to use a shard on her wrists. Guards wrestled it away. After the 3rd attempt, she was kept under constant, direct observation. A guard remained in her room at all times, watching her every moment. Tiberius eventually had her executed, but on his timeline, not hers. Forced feeding removed the last shred of control. Hold the woman down. Force her mouth open. Pour liquid grain mixture down her throat. Multiple cases document women's teeth broken during this process. The feeding continued until the woman ate voluntarily or died from feeding injuries, though death was rare because guards were trained to keep women alive. The message was absolute. You don't even own your death. Your life belongs to imperial authority completely. Some imperial wives outlived their emperor husbands. Popular assumption says they were finally free. That assumption is catastrophically wrong. Livia Drusilla married Augustus and remained married 51 years. Augustus died when she was 71. She survived him by 15 years. Those final years were spent under the protection of her stepson Tiberius, the new emperor. Protection meant surveillance. She required permission for all activities, movements monitored constantly, correspondence read before delivery, visitors screened and reported. Tiberius refused to see her for the final 3 years of her life. She lived in the palace. He lived on Capri. She sent letters weekly requesting a visit. He ignored all of them. She died without seeing him again. He refused to attend her funeral. Domitia Longina was married to Domitian. He was assassinated when she was 42. She lived until at least 67, possibly older. Those 25 years were spent restricted to a villa outside Rome, allowed supervised visitors, allowed to manage a small household, but she couldn't leave the property without imperial permission, couldn't participate in social or political life. Multiple emperors succeeded Domitian during her lifetime. None freed her. She lived as a permanent semi-prisoner until death. Contemporary accounts universally described surviving wives as ghosts. They couldn't make decisions without anxiety. They flinched at loud noises, couldn't sleep through the night. They had outlived their tormentors but couldn't outlive the torture that stayed with them always. The written record survived because some women found ways to speak when speaking meant death. Letters were smuggled from exile locations, messages carved into walls where they lived. Deathbed testimonies recorded by sympathetic servants who outlived them. This wasn't aberrant behavior by one or two unstable emperors. This was systematic across multiple emperors and multiple decades. This was how imperial power functioned. Marriage to an emperor meant ownership, never partnership. A wife was property to be used, controlled, and destroyed at will. Octavia was executed at 21 after 8 years of torture. Messalina executed at 26 after being forced to participate in her own humiliation. Julia the Elder died in exile after 20 years alone on an island. Agrippina the Younger was killed by her own son after years of abuse. Domitia Longina survived but lived 25 years as a prisoner. Plancina was prevented from ending her life so the emperor could control her death. These women existed. They suffered things worse than death. They tried to survive. They tried to resist in small ways when resistance was possible. They tried to leave some record that someone might find and remember. That record exists. The marble statues meant nothing. The golden jewelry meant nothing. The imperial titles meant nothing. These women were prisoners in plain sight. They were tortured in rooms lined with silk. They were erased while wearing crowns. But they left enough evidence that their stories can be recovered. And now, 2,000 years later, you know what those wedding nights really meant. You know what happened in the silence between public appearances. You know why some fates are worse than death? Because death is an ending, and what these women endured was designed never to end. The emperors are dust now. The palaces are ruins. But the testimony remains, carved into stone and smuggled in letters and whispered by guards who couldn't forget what they'd witnessed. These women made sure of that. They made sure someone someday would know their names and what it cost to carry them.